holy war to purify this land and rid the world of the last remnants of resistance.
We were once mankind. We were humanity. And now, we're no more than pests. Vermin. They came here to exterminate us. They took our history and culture. They covered our landmarks in dying humanity. The wail of the dying carried for miles. They're building some kind of breeding facility for those that survive. People that have defected say it's worse than hell. Humans becoming some kind of surrogate incubators for the alien young. They killed us in waves when they first arrived. They built these megastructures that spew methane, manufacturing their atmosphere. They've sown their crops, snuffing out our plant life, raising the global temperature, causing our cities to flood. They waged war on Earth. They set fire to our forests. It's already hard to breathe. Impossible to breathe if you are close to the stacks. Rats. Insects. Humans. They hack into our psyche, into our minds, paralyzing us, taking control of the cerebrum and the limbic system, rendering us as slaves. We've been able to design a brain barrier that protects us from their influence. They know we can't produce enough of these for everyone, that it's just a matter of time before the entire planet is theirs. But we are survivors. Scrounging enough to eat. Gathering enough morale to fight. Knows we're already dead. I wonder if only one sick primordial instinct keeps marching us forward aimlessly. Every rational thought tells us it's over. Every vile, deceptive, chemical emotion tells us it isn't. We're sold a different story by our politicians.
This next section takes us from that information about reality and starts to relate it to the situation we find ourselves in. There are 20 years between these two photographs, and in that time, really amazing things have happened. So many people have gone from that to that, and it's an exponential curve that's gathering pace all the time. And people are starting to see what is increasingly there, that we are watching the unfolding imposition of a fascist global state or communist global state. They're the same either way. I'm sure people in fascist Germany and people in Stalinist Russia thought there was a big difference between the worlds that they lived in. Different names for the same basic control system. But I would suggest that if we stay only at the level of the five senses, only at the level of the world we see, banking scams, manipulated wars, Orwellian imposition, then we're not going to get truly what is going on. Because I say this, look at it. This world has been changing and is changing so rapidly in terms of all different aspects of this control system, the way they manipulate education, manipulate wars, put in the people they want as presidents, give us all this shite through food and drink, control the media, manufacture the global warming scam, big pharma, and 9/11, all that stuff. And it's coming in such a coordinated way. So if we are going to think that this situation that we're seeing unfold goes back to a few men and women in dark suits or whatever sitting round a table saying what's our next move, we are clearly massively missing the point. And the vast majority of people who over the last few years have started investigating this, they will not go any further. They will not go any further because A, their belief systems won't let them, often their religious belief system, but also they are fearing what other people will think about them if they go into some of these areas I'm going to go into now. What people make of it is up to them. My right to say it is up to me. So yes, it's not just people sitting around a table somewhere in the world discussing the next move. There's the level where we see this unfolding in the news and what have you. Then there's this other dimensional, non-human level to look at, as I will in this section. Then there's the level of the nature of reality, which I've introduced already. And then there's this whole stuff about the moon, which I'll get into in this section too. And the rabbit hole doesn't end there. It goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And the deeper you go into the rabbit hole, the more we understand what the game is, the more we can change the game. And it's all about the control and programming of perception. That's the only way the few, and it is a few compared with the global population, that the billions can be controlled. Manipulating how we interact with reality, keeping from us that we are consciousness, putting us in these bubbles of our sense of limitation and I can't, manipulating the way we decode reality and therefore making us see the world as the control system wants us to see it. That's the basis of all of it going through the day, because that's the basis of all of it going through the whole conspiracy. So yes, of course, on one level it does manifest as dark suits sitting around a table discussing the next move. But that's still the play-out world of this conspiracy. It's not its origin. It goes beyond them into the advisors in the shadows, the Mandelsons in this country. Peter Mandelson, if he's not manipulating, it gets withdrawal symptoms, that man. And into the Rahm Emanuels, ditto, in America, the controller, handler of Barack Obama. It goes into deeper levels, beyond them, deep in the hidden secret society network. And eventually, it goes out of this dimension. And that's where this whole thing is really coming from. Beyond the frequency range of visible light. And it involves non-human entities. Some of them people call the greys. The main ones, I would say, and have been saying for a long, long time, take a reptilian form. They operate outside. They can come into visible light, but in terms of the reptilian part of this, they can't stay here for that long. So people say, why don't they just come and take over? Because they can't, or they would. They can come for so long, but their vibrational difference, incompatibility, means they have to leave. They can't stay for long, although there are technological ways they can stay for longer. And they operate outside visible light, and they manipulate this reality through bloodlines, interbreeding bloodlines that I'll come to. And we call them the Illuminati families. So, we operate with invisible light, But outside of that, sharing the same space, is infinite other worlds and realities. And if a so-called UFO comes into this reality, because it's coming into visible light from where we cannot decode, it just seems to appear out of flipping nowhere. Because what it's done, it hasn't actually come in, it's just changed its vibrational state to resonate with invisible light, and it's like, it came out of nowhere. And then how often do you see it? Honestly, mate, there was this bloody UFO and it disappeared just in front of my eyes. What are you on, mate? You on the pop or what? What it's done is increased its vibrational resonance to go beyond on visible light. Therefore, to the observer, it disappears. It doesn't disappear at all. It's left visible light. And this range of frequency we call our world is being manipulated from vibrational frequencies beyond it. And Satanism is a network within visible light that interacts with these reptilian entities in various ways I'll get to before the end of the day.
I mean, I assume you've heard the old Nietzsche quote about he who stares into the abyss looks into him. He who fights monsters may become a monster. I'm butchering the quote, but
yeah, no, it's completely right. Like, a lot of these people are just, they're finding monsters everywhere. Tucker Carlson's a monster. Joe Rogan's a monster. You know, the guy at the Road to the Punisher tattoo's a monster. Donald Trump's a monster. You know, Putin's a monster. All these people are monsters. And meanwhile, they're just absorbing all this hatred and just superpowering themselves with bullshit and anger. And it just becomes so vile.
But
like,
do people realize that hatred eventually destroys you?
Not when you're blind to it, and not when you're consuming historically speaking, this generation probably consumes record amounts of alcohol and drugs, like unseen or heard of. Like, I can't think of any other period of time where you could go get ketamine or LSD or shrooms or cocaine or fentanyl or alcohol or booze, beer, malt liquor. You can get anything. And not only can you get anything, you can get anything through Snapchat and Discord. Like, I literally asked a guy here if I could get some mushrooms, right? Because mushrooms are legal here, so it's no big deal. So I was like, hey, do you know a guy who's selling mushrooms that can maybe hook me up? He's like, yeah, bro, check out my Discord. And he shows me a menu. So, like, this shit is on demand now. Historically speaking, there's probably never been a generation so intoxicated as the American youth right now.
Oh, God.
So that's plaguing a lot of decision making. Like, it's really, really bad. And not only that, now they're all addicted, but now it's all fentanyl. So, like, I've known people here who are still actively using cocaine, and I'm like, dude, you need to test that shit before you do it. And they're like, man, if I fucking die, I die. You only live once, right? And it's like, yeah, no, your little bullshit positive nihilistic spin isn't fucking cute. It's dangerous, and I don't want to see you die. But they don't give a shit because live every day like it's your last. And that is majority of the people that live in Eugene and Springfield, as far as like 20 to 30-year-olds.
Fuck.
It's bad, dude. And a lot of these are coming from blue communities. Like, I feel like drug legalization, that should have been a national effort, and we should have all acted collectively. But when you have areas like Oregon and Washington, California being the only ones, well, we just absorbed all of the drug users. We absorbed everybody who just wanted to come out and do this openly. So now it's just a part of the culture to where most people are on meth or fentanyl, or like, even when I was back in my drug days, I knew that I could do it. So I would be out drunk as shit, coked out, tripping on LSD in the middle of the fucking Walmart with the walls melting, thinking I'm in fucking heaven. Sometimes thinking I was in fucking hell. I had some of the worst bad trips you've ever fucking imagined in public with people acting like it's normal. It's like not only normalized, it's encouraged, because like that's how you get in. You know, all the kids are getting high together. We're all hanging out in a dark room watching movies. Like, it makes sense, right?
I mean, one of the notorious things about the Nazis were that so many of them were high on fucking meth.
Mm-hmm. And you see it everywhere else in American society too. Like all the women are on SSRIs, all the men are getting testosterone treatments and everything under the sun. Like we are living in an oil snakeman salesman's wet dream. Like the little old man that was going around selling you bullshit in the wild, wild west days, his future came true. We live in it. Like everyone is just poisoning themselves and intoxicating themselves. Like, but the fact that it wasn't a national effort means that it all went to the blue cities. It all went to the blue states. So whenever I talk with people down in Texas, they can't believe the shit that I'm telling them. And then when I go down to visit, like I said, I've only visited my family in Texas in the last 8 years, like 2 or 3 times. Every single time I walk down there or go down there, talk about a time machine. Like it's like I'm a kid again, and there's like no drugs and no violence and no craziness, and there's more people and the drivers are shittier than ever. But past that, like it ain't this, and this just gets worse and worse and worse, and people are like, it's fine.
I mean, here in DC, a number of drugs were legalized. Mushrooms were legalized a few years ago, but I don't see anywhere near the same degree of whacked out behavior that I've seen on the news about the West Coast.
Yeah, and I will say they went against the or they or recriminalized it, so like I have been seeing a lot less use out in the streets, but that doesn't mean I'm seeing less high people. That doesn't mean I'm seeing less people intoxicated. They're just doing it inside now. So it's like the damage has already been done. Nobody's going back on their addictions because Oregon decided to walk back. Like people are locked in, and there's so much here ready to facilitate that. And not to mention, now that things are illegal again, we have cartel all over the West Coast.
Oh shit!
Chinese cartel, Mexican cartel, they're the ones operating the farms. Like they're not running these farms to grow carrots. Like they're doing it for drugs.
I mean, I told some of my classmates that most of the grow operations in Colorado after legalization were cartel controlled. That just because you make growing something previously illegal doesn't mean the operations are still all going to be legal. You just make it impossible to tell what's legal and what isn't.
And like I used to think I had answers around how to solve the drug war. Clearly I don't. I think it's very complex, but
well, go look
Oregon
at the
did not handle this shit well.
Go look at the history of vodka and Russians. Taxes raised for addiction treatment programs don't always go to addiction treatment programs. And at the end of the Tsarist era, most government revenue came from vodka taxes. At the end of the Soviet Union, most government revenue came from vodka taxes.
Jesus. If that ain't the most Russian shit, though. That's wild.
Well, getting the population addicted so you can tax them is not necessarily the best thing for a civilization.
No, and didn't Japan do something similar during COVID? Wasn't it like they increased their advertising, or they were basically trying to encourage people to keep drinking more alcohol? That way the alcohol stocks wouldn't plummet or something like that. I think it was something along those lines.
I'm not familiar with that.
I'm gonna pull it up and I'll link it in the description of this if I can find it. But I think it was somewhere along those lines where they're like, oh, people are drinking less. This is a problem.
Oh. I mean, one of the problems with COVID was you just started to see alcoholism skyrocket. Because when people can't be with friends, they lose their emotional outlets, and some people turn to alcohol as a coping mechanism. For others, friends are a moderating influence on addiction. So
yeah, and it's I mean, the damage afterwards too. Like I've realized like putting down drinking, my mind isn't the same as before I started drinking. Like there's damage done. There's things done to your brain that are different. And I think a lot of people don't know how to deal with the damage from the drugs and the alcohol. So to them, their brain is just fried and they just don't know what to do. And I see that a lot because there are a lot of people who are walking away from it, but you realize that your psyche's different because like this isn't your granddaddy's getting sober. For a lot of these kids, it's not just putting down the bottle. It's putting down the bottle and the pills, the cocaine and the psychedelics. and maybe even some of the self-harming, food, whatever your addiction is or whatever your outlet is, like a lot of these people, you can't even just put it all down at once. You got to do bit by bit by bit. So a lot of times when people in my generation are trying to quit, it's like, I have to quit the drinking, but I can't drink the cocaine, or I can't quit the cocaine, or vice versa. Or I'll start with the acid, but I still need the pills to get me through the pain. And then always definitely keep the weed. Weed's always the last to go, if at all. And for me, I realized I couldn't get rid of that. But
My God.
it's a predicament for so many people, because like I said, it's not just one addiction. You don't just do cocaine and then drink all the time and then have one addiction. That's two addictions you have to tackle now. And now it's like taste the rainbow, try every drug on the planet, have a fucking fistful of Molly and scoop fucking parts of your brain out. Let's go. It'll make the song better. It'll make the bass bump. Like, at what cost?
And there's a strong relationship uh, between a dysfunctional society and addiction. And so in 1984, Victory Gin was an aspect of the totalitarian society. But in Nazi Germany, you could, for a while, you could smell a German offensive because you could smell schnapps in the air. The German soldiers were drinking before going into battle. You could tell when the Soviet offensive was about to happen because Soviet soldiers were drinking vodka. And during the 80s, communist governments loved to brag about, oh, in the West, here's this exploding drug addiction, which they partially helped by funneling supplies to the drug dealers, but that's a whole nother story.
Misinformation, Cyprian. Misinformation.
That's a major part of North Korea's budget. But you end up with a situation where the communist countries were bragging about how people in the West were using drugs, and the people in the East were just trying to drown their sorrows in alcohol. And now we've kind of got the worst of both worlds.
Yeah. One thing I've learned is you can be depressed as hell at your lowest point in life, but you can still turn the world into rainbows. And I think that helps add to a lot of this cognitive dissonance we're seeing. Is like, I've had a lot of addictions in waves. What happened before Antifa? Psychedelic abuse. Years of psychedelic abuse, talking to the devil, seeing God, talking in tongues, shadows coming out of the wall to grab me, going to hell, perceiving time differently. I went to the hospital once after getting into the more I talk to people, the more they think it was angel dust. I thought it was a purple LSD tab. But after thinking I died and went to hell and spent about 7 or 8 hours in that experience in a vortex of demons and imps grabbing my throat and pulling out my hair, but my hair never coming out, just eternally pulling my hair. So just imagine threads of your head just never stopping while an imp chokes you. And going to the hospital, and everybody in my entire life that I had ever known from the point I was born was in my head on the other side of the hospital curtains, talking about how much of a disappointment I was and about how I had failed them, to where suddenly, even though I'm the only person I know in my circle who lives in Oregon, somehow everybody got onto a plane in the last few hours and is outside my hospital room and getting very specific with all of the letdowns and all the things I've done wrong in my life. That is one psychedelic horror story, of which I have many. Now take my generation and most of the kids that live here in Oregon, we all have them. We have seen demons, we have communicated with angels, we have received psychedelic visions, we have heard voices, we have started speaking in tongues. Psychedelics aren't just about understanding the universe. When you're mixing in addiction and alcohol and all this negative frequency and energy into that, you're going to fucking hell in the most literal of senses. And there's a lot of people I know that were in Antifa that have had a lot of these experiences, and I really think that helps lead to the cognitive dissonance. But then you also see that a lot of this woke bullshit is getting into the psychedelic field now, to where now you can have people who will be under these trips in controlled circumstances, but with these people getting into their head with political ideology.
Oh, God.
And I think also, to get a little nuttier with it, what Alex Jones has been saying about them mapping out the DMT realm, I have had shared experiences, psychedelic experiences with people in the same room as me, to where our experiences have synced up completely. I don't think the psychedelic space is one that at the current moment is untapped by the government and the CIA. I think that they want access to the psychedelic sphere. They want access to these realms just as much as they want access to our dreams and our thoughts. And I think that that's a big reason that psychedelics play a huge part in what's happening in Oregon, because I feel like they've helped twist the perception. And a lot of this ideology, when you're constantly being fed these ideologies, but you're getting messages from God, you're getting messages from creation, from the universe, from these beings, whatever may have you, whatever experiences you're having, but then you're sobering it up and you're mixing it in with the political ideology, and you're mixing it up with the internet, and now you're letting that dictate what the message is supposed to be. That helps get into your head of utopian thinking and godlike status, and this being bigger than anything anybody else could possibly imagine, because they haven't seen the things that you've seen. They haven't seen the colors. They haven't smelt the smells. They're not willing to go on that journey like you were. So you must be doing the right thing. And there's people who will be having shitty day after shitty day after shitty day, but they'll have a mushroom trip and, oh, this is just the one thing I need to do better. And then they'll do it better for a few days. And then they go back to being that shitty person, but then they take the ego with them of, oh, I learned this big, important, mighty lesson. Aren't I better than you? Something I was very guilty of doing on multiple occasions. And that fuels the ego, and that helps build, it's one of the bricks in the wall that keeps you from seeing the other side. I think there's a lot of bricks.
God. I mean, I shudder to think what would happen if the totalitarian dictators of the past had access to brainwashing drugs. That's, my God.
We're all Charles Manson now.
But one of the observations about, well, there were experiments with interrogation drugs in the 30s and 40s, but even when faced with the prospect of getting information about Nazi atrocities, the authorities in the Nuremberg trials decided against using drugs on prisoners. So it's kind of remarkable to me that people would do it on themselves.
It's like chasing a dragon too, because like so many of these trips are so different, but like even with having seen some of the darkness, I always wanted to go back. Just knowing that there's worlds beyond this world, like always taking interest with things like Star Wars or Silent Hill or Narnia, instances where there's a world just on the other side, and knowing that's attainable in your universe. Well, maybe if I could just go back this time, I can get it right. Maybe I can find what I'm looking for. And then you sober up and you realize, oh, I was just getting crazier and crazier and crazier. Like I said, there's points where I spoke in tongues. I would walk down the street. I remember once doing it for like 3 hours on end. Couldn't tell you why, but I was just like, I'm not even going to do it because it sounds so wild, but like tongue flipping, like prayer tongue style. And sometimes I try to make it sound Russian, and other times I try to make it sound Mexican. And then I'd walk by someone and I just try to see how convincing I would be when doing it. Fried out of my goddamn mind. And these are just normal sights in Oregon. This is just things people do. But
They start to understand the power lines collapsing under the weight of a storm more and more.
yeah. Everyone's fried. Everyone's fried. And it's like I always say, the people who aren't on drugs, they're on social media, which God help them with that one. At least I can get over that one. Like,
Oh my God.
Psychedelics, I think, are going to be a big part of this story moving forward, because I think the more people who speak out, I'm hoping to find other people who can resonate with that, because, like I said, so many people I can think of in Antifa that I knew, like, we were tripping together. We were talking about these things. What entity did you see? This is the entity that I saw. I mean, hell, shit, let me grab this for you. save the story for a standalone video because I want to tell it in depth. But talking about conspiracies and reptiles, like, this is my entity. I keep it on my door. Here, let me have a. Oh, that's my camera.
Okay.
Reptilian, white hood, Joker paint, and this thing came to me during a mushroom trip after I had decided to leave Antifa. After I was like, this is insane. I don't know what to do. I saw it appear in a fractal in my shower, and it was in a white hood, and it had a long gray reptilian feature with Joker paint that was just kind of like melting off of it, and like there was no solid form of it. It was like reaching throughout space and time to communicate with me, and it was in a black room, and its tail was holding a stick with a mirror shard that was creating the fractal impression, and it was trying to confirm to me that I needed to walk away and that I needed to put down some of my bullshit. And I went crazy with trying to figure it out for a while, because there was even times where I was like, did I get communicated with by a reptile? Was this a reptilian alien? Was it underground? Was it on the moon? What is this? And ultimately, as time unfolded, I had another trip that actually connected to that trip. It was one of those instances where sometimes you can have two trips connect, I guess, and I felt the same thing and I saw the same colors, and it came back to me, and it was just like, no, I'm your creative conscious. And it went from a reptile to everything in my room and everything on me, my arms, smiles and eyes and teeth. And it just simply told me, it's like, if you don't do what you need to do, and if you don't accept God, I'm going to die, and you are going to die. And then it just kind of faded back out, and I was just like, okay.
Do psychedelics make people more inclined to see intentionality behind random things?
Describe what you mean, because I feel like I can go off a couple of angles with that.
So there's a known psychological condition where people might incorrectly perceive that, say, a glass is a person. It has agency. It thinks.
Mm-hmm.
They would perceive an inanimate object as if it was animate.
Yes. Yeah, I'd say that definitely happens. and like it's like a message from the universe, and like only you're conscious of it, and it's a matter of vibration and dimensional space. Is that kind of what you're meaning?
That's some of it. Yeah, that it's not just that it has that an inanimate object is animate, that there is intentionality behind it, but that it's very, very important. That effect is real?
Yeah. You want to see something wild? So in line with that trip, like I said, I'm going to give it a even more in-depth explanation. And this one's a little trippier for me. And for some people, they could take that to mean really crazy shit. One of the things I saw before this reptile appeared was it was a swarm of fractals, and I was looking into my shower curtain, which had no reflection, and I was inside these jars with frogs, like bullfrog specimens, and there were points I could look in, and it was like I was a part of a speck of flesh that would flake off their body, and I could see between the ribs, and it would just kind of be going around and looking at these frogs through the jars. If you've ever seen the intro to Alien Resurrection, it was kind of like that. So like I'm in these jars looking at these distorted frogs and images, but I could also see people in white coats, it seemed like, on the other side, and shadows moving around. So about 3 weeks after this trip happened, right, my buddy Kellen, who I talk about sometimes on the podcast, wanted me to help them move into a new apartment. Somebody that they knew went to Portland, wound up going into a mental hospital, and was into a bunch of really crazy witchy shit. So I wound up getting this, something that she left behind. I found this making its way to me.
An old preserved frog?
Oh, yeah, bullfrog in a jar.
Okay.
So sometimes there's trippier instances like that, but then there's instances that I feel like I took it to where other people could take it to, where everything is a message from God. Everything is a message from the universe. Everything is geared directly, specifically at them. Every number has to mean something. So there's like trippier instances like that, and then there's like oh, the world revolves around me, kind of becomes like main character syndrome, I think the kids would call it.
But hearing about that, that makes me think that one of the major things that turns rational suspicion into a conspiracy theory, a fake one, not a real conspiracy issue, is that people misperceive agency. So on average, men make more than women. Now, is that because of discrimination? Or is that because, well, men tend to go into higher risk fields than women? So if people perceive that there's more intentionality, they're going to be much more angry.
Mm-hmm.
If they perceive there's less intentionality, they'll be more passive.
Yeah, I feel like with psychedelics, I feel like in the beginning, the whole thing is like, you know, you kind of shed your fear, you shed your paranoia. If it's done correctly, like you're open, you're free, nothing can come to hurt you right now. You're at one with yourself, you're right where you need to be on planet Earth. But it's with the continual drug use that I think you start to see a lot of that. The more scoops are getting taken out of your brain, the longer you've been away from reality, it starts to take its toll. And I think that's when you start to get a lot of the paranoia. It's like I said, whenever I see some of these stories now where people are like, dude was out in the park hunting reptiles before he killed himself or whatever, I could totally see myself being that guy, given that I honestly had to debate myself, was that a real reptilian entity that contacted me? You know, thankfully with enough looking out and analysis, I came to an alternate conclusion. Also doesn't mean I don't believe there's not reptilian races. I do. Just going to throw that out there. But I'm not going to let that dictate all my other political discussions or anything. I could speculate and theorize, but I'm not going to let that drive what I think on something like transgender issues or global war or anything like that. Like I could just speculate. But I can see how someone can get like potentially a vision like that and go ape shit. And I wonder if sometimes if the reptilian depiction comes to people of a certain mindset, because certain people see certain things under psychedelic visions in attune with their mentality. I think there's something about people with more of a conspiratorial way of thinking, or who are at the very least more open with certain ideas or willing to receive certain ideas and think it a certain way, that encounter reptiles. Like Terrence McKenna has a whole bit on it about how he goes to the reptilian planet and where they live and what they're doing, and then he comes back from it. And I think that that's where you're starting to see a lot of the reptile crap get out of hand, is people are frying their brains. They think the reptiles are chasing them, and they're not interpreting their psychedelic visions properly, and they're mixing that in with, I mean, look, when you start to go into like David Icke and the reptilian agenda and all that, it can get pretty freaky. It's wild. But when you start mixing that with psychedelics and you start to think like that's, it's not even to say it's not real. I actually believe a lot of what David Icke writes, but some people can take things a little too far for their own personal life, and they'll perceive demons that aren't there. So I do wonder if people are just receiving psychedelic visions of reptiles and going haywire with it. It's one of my
What I'm
theories.
hearing is that abuse of psychedelics, I mean, I've heard there are benefits to limited use, but excessive use seems like it's poised to create the kind of paranoia and lack of reality testing that would turn people into very dangerous radicals.
Yeah, and then at that point too, it's like, well, you put reality on the world. So I think a lot of these people too that find themselves in the trance space, whenever they're going through psychedelics, they're getting in the mind state of, we're all one, we're all the same. There's no difference between humans. And when they come out of it, they're thinking that, but they're applying it in a very, very different way. But from them, that's a vision from God that you cannot argue with. Their God. But it's because you can't argue with the psychedelic space. Like you can't. There's no one alive on this planet who can sit here and tell me I did not see a reptile in a white hood with Joker paint. You can't tell me that because I've seen it. What you can tell me perhaps is that I've misinterpreted that, and have you thought about thinking of this another way? But a lot of people, when they're just going off on their tangents and what they believe, they're not really bringing that into it because they don't want to sound crazy. But if psychedelics are going to be a part of our everyday lives, well, we better buckle up because everybody's going to start seeing angels and demons and shit's going to get really fucking weird. And a lot of people are going to make contact with aliens, and a lot of people are going to see reptiles, and a lot of people are going to see animal human hybrids. And it's all going to exist in this little world that only you and potentially the government one day can see.
And they don't have people around them to say, hey, you had a bad trip, man, don't take it too seriously.
No, there are people like that, and God bless those people for being around. The ones who call them the water fairies, they're like, here's some water, man, eat some water, drink some water, eat this food. I know you don't want to, eat this grilled cheese, man, it's going to be okay. But simultaneously, there's a lot of those people too who they know that kind of thing because they've been doing that kind of thing for a long time, or they're your dealers in a lot of those cases. So it's like, I don't know, the psychedelic realm is very, very difficult to interpret. And if you try to interpret it by yourself or with a group of kids, like you need people like Terrence McKenna and Joe Rogan and people who study this kind of thing and religion and all of these things. That's what you need to understand the psychedelic space, history, like the cool things in life. That's what you need to understand that. But if you're just taking it from memes and political ideology, then you're turning what should be one of the most meaningful experiences of your entire life into one of the worst decisions you could have possibly made for yourself.
Well, that's I'm reminded of a Farscape episode. Yeah, I know I'm going back to a science fiction thing, but
I just started that 2 days ago, finally.
okay. Basically, they encounter a space station inhabited by children. And the children have their own mythology about what these documents actually mean. But they're just completely different. They can't interpret what's going on because they never had anyone there to teach them what things actually were.
Yep. And, God bless the people in my life who I met here who did help me. I met one guy, his name is Larry. He helped start the cannabis churches up in Canada. Like, dude was a big figure, worked with some of the top weed growers in Oregon, is running his whole shebang right now. And he had a whole setup on his back porch, and he would just make like pound after pound of dab because it was legal. So he had a whole oil refinery set up on his back apartment. So he'd always have me come over and test it, and we'd just sit there and we'd talk about the universe, and we talk about God, and we talk about religion, and we talk about all these crazy things. And like the Antifa shit happened a couple years afterwards, but I think people like that really they really can leave an impression on you to where they just want you to do better and be better and to keep questioning and to just treat yourself right. And there, for all the bad, there's a lot of really good people like that in Oregon who, yeah, there's some people out there who they'll take acid day in and day out, but they can regulate it to the point where they're not going to go fucking batshit with it. But all these kids think that they can be that, and they see that and they're like, oh, I just want the drugs. It's like, okay, well, what do you know about that person's pain? What do you know about them that they had to overcome to where no drop of acid on the planet can ruin their fucking night? What tragedy did they see? You haven't seen that same tragedy. You start to realize that it's all about the human story, and that people want to have these experiences without having the story. They want to be a communist without having the struggle. They want to be black without ever having living in the hood. They want to be trans without ever having felt gender dysphoria. Like,
They're just vague labels that they put on like clothes rather than really being something you are. It's
yeah.
It's like there's some defect in self-evaluation. So you talked about a guy who can use acid every day and he's still semi-functional.
Well, not really every day. You can't take acid every day, but continuously. I've met a couple people like that. Or at least seemingly functional from the outside.
Which suggests that there's at least something in them that helps them avoid just chasing after any hallucination.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you've got a lot of people who encounter an idea and they chase after it without any self-evaluation to see, is this realistic? Is this a good idea? Am I just fooling myself?
Yeah.
So it
It's the
seems
same.
like there's something within people that could have been keeping them from chasing unreality, but instead it's missing and they just chase unreality.
Mhm. And then the further and further you chase it, the less capable you are of being able to get back to that thing and figure out what you need to do.
Take me to your leader. No, I did have one DMT trip way back, like maybe the second or third or fourth way back, where it was completely different. It's the only one I've ever had like that, and it was completely different. And the way I put it to myself was the big people were home. And it was an entirely different feeling. And many people, actually, I've never quite had this myself, but many people report DMT trips where they break in on an entity who is not pleased at all and demands to know how the hell you got there. And it's this, who are you? And then various sorts of dialogues go on, and one person described being then just hurled through all of time, like exploded back from this thing and going through all the recapitulation of ontogeny, and it's weird stuff. DMT trips, mine are always as I described, but some people report and these may be synergies with antidepressants or something like that, but apparently very stable and strange worlds. Worlds with alien peoples and animals and cities and, very science fiction-y stuff. That's why this Bell's theorem, I don't think we use that word, but this non-locality that we talked about may have something to do with the phenomenon of the imagination. Like, it's occurred to me over the years that what we call imagination might simply be hyperdimensional perception, and you're actually seeing worlds and places that truly exist somewhere scattered through the galaxies like grains of sand, but no place you will ever contact or visit in the flesh, but that the data is somehow present. There seems to be some kind of tuning thing that needs to go on. Possibly with technology. I had a really weird experience years ago. I took LSD one evening with a bunch of people, and it was fairly casual and social, and smoked a bunch of weed, and this went on for a couple of hours, and it didn't really ever seem to come on, or it just seemed to be very light. And then I climbed on my motorcycle and went home and decided I would go to bed, and I decided that I would smoke one last joint before going to bed. And I had one of those stand-up electrical resistance heaters that you get in at the Salvation Army, if you're a poor student. And I said, so I turned it on as I started to smoke this joint, and it was badly wired, and it made this sound like, and as I began to listen to this sound, I went to lizard land. And I entered into this completely coherent thing which lasted for hours about this world inhabited by these intelligent reptilian beings. And we went through their art, their history, their theories of jewelry making, their philosophy, their polity, their science, their religion, their fashion, and it was like endless stuff about this very specific reptilian world. Well, then later I tried again. I took LSD with my arm around my heater and had by then been preaching it in the streets that this was the And I could never really find my way back, which is a typical phenomenon of higher dimensional phase space. Ralph taught me, doing the reverse of what you did doesn't steer you back to where you started. You have to find your way forward through the matrix.
Spent years talking to entities of his imagination, documenting that in books like the Red Book. He made that a visionary practice and had illuminating conversations with specters of his own imagination. But of course, he also believed that there was a collective element to those. And so you might say that, well, to the degree, for example, that we're each inhabited by dark impulses, we might say, well, we're each prey to the same demonic forces. That's one way of thinking about it. And they're the same, and they're transpersonal, and they exist to some degree cross-culturally, and they span time. And so these creatures of imagination can have histories and can inhabit us in some real sense, and they can do that collectively. And then, so that complicates things tremendously. But then I would also ask, in your investigations, your long-term investigations of multiple ayahuasca experiences across different people, are there any commonalities of entities that strike you as particularly significant? I know people talk about clown figures, for example, mechanical clowns in the DMT
like
state, and
elf machines and this sort
elves.
of thing.
Yeah, exactly. The elf
Elves.
machines. And of course, that's complicated too, because once one person starts talking about it, that might increase the probability that other people would experience it. But have you seen commonalities of entity experience that would suggest something, the existence of something that is at least transpersonal, even though it might also still be subjective, whatever that means in such a context?
Yes. I have, and I think this exists in these shamanic traditions, and the ayahuasca is a particularly good example of that. And again, I have not seen anything that convinces me. I mean, I'm basically a Jungian, so I believe in the collective unconscious as this, it's a good model, this transpersonal realm of shared archetypes and all that, and then there's the individual unconscious. I haven't seen anything in the reports of the psychonauts that would not fit into that model, that says, oh, well, this doesn't really fit. This is outside that model, and so that model's not valid. I haven't seen that. I think that it is. I think basically these entities, they are experienced as real, but they come from the collective unconscious. And if you look at the ayahuasca traditions, and there is an interesting book here that's very illustrative of this, which many people know about. It's the book that. You're familiar with the artist Pablo Amaringo, the visionary Peruvian artist. He and Luis Eduardo Luna wrote a book. He painted his visions, right? He remembered all his visions in perfect detail, painted these visions. And Eduardo and he collaborated on a book called Ayahuasca Visions, the religious iconography of a Peruvian shaman. It's still in print. The book is remarkable because it's typical coffee table style format with full color illustrations of the visions on one page and Eduardo's descriptions in English on the facing page, dissecting all the elements of the entities and everything else that you see in these visions, as narrated by Pablo. I mean, Pablo, Eduardo Luna was basically just the transcriber, but Pablo described in great detail, dissected each one of these paintings, and there are about, I guess, 20 or so of these paintings in this book. And it's basically a course in vegetalismo. It's talking about vegetalismo, this practice, which is really an amalgam of many indigenous traditions and kind of mushed together into a mestizo tradition. But he describes these entities, they all have names, they have a particular appearance, and the plants, the animals, even there are UFOs, there are all kinds of things in these visions. Pablo describes every one of them, and any ayahuasquero in training, apprenticing under Pablo or any of these traditional ayahuasqueros, they're going to see these things. This is a cultural context. They're going to see these things. And what they see is going to be similar, So it's sort of like Terence's, self-transforming elf machines. Terence says that, he has a huge voice in the meme sphere. Pretty soon everybody's seeing self-transforming elf machines. People, that's what people see.
Well, you could imagine, the brain is obviously an organ that can produce personalities because it produces our personalities. And it seems to me that it's highly probable that the way that we organize information is in the form of personality. So, and I certainly got a fair bit of this from thinking about Jung's work. If you're inhabited by a rage state, which I think is a good way of thinking about it, you might think, well, what form does the anger take? And the answer is, well, it has a personality. You might act like enraged people that you've seen in movies. You might act like enraged people that you've seen in your life. The rage has a goal, which is the crushing of the opponent, let's say, and it has perceptions and it has action patterns. It's a personality. And you could conceptualize the rage spirit as Ares, the god of war, and that would be a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it. And it could be that all of our micro perceptions and all of our macro perceptions, for that matter, have the intrinsic form of personality, and that's partly what we encounter when we dream. And so I was thinking too, that as the gods, if the gods are aggregates of micro personalities, that might be one way of thinking about it. They're micro personalities that are aggregated within societies across time and then can be apprehended collectively to some degree. As you move towards a monotheistic vision of the world, what you're moving toward is the ultimate aggregation of all these socially modified micro-personalities into one conceptual scheme. And that would parallel that hierarchy of cognition and conception that, well, we already discussed that people like Friston are working on. And so it isn't that surprising, I suppose, if you think about it that way, if the brain is a personality-producing machine, so to speak, that there are certain states that you can encounter under the influence of chemical alteration where you encounter those personalities, even those that have some degree of autonomy. Rage has some degree of autonomy, and so does lust, and so does thirst, and so does hunger. They're not exactly you. They're forces or personalities, which is a more accurate way of thinking about it, that you can fall prey to. And so why can't that occur in a more complex manner?
Well, I think it can. This totally fits within the Jungian model, that within the collective unconscious there are these I forget the exact term that he used, but these complexes, almost like autonomous personalities, and multiple personality disorder is a recognized thing. And I guess in some ways, all of us have it in a certain sense, in that we have, we do have these multiple personalities, but they like rage, lust, and so on, but they don't take over the controls. Most of the time they're suppressed to a certain degree, but they're always there, and they're influencing whoever it is in the cabin at the bridge that's running the thing. And in pathology, they can take over. And then you've got a problem.
Well, they do with Tourette's syndrome. They do with Tourette's. They do with obsessive compulsive disorder.
Exactly.
And you can think about the relationship between these motivational states like rage or anxiety, let's say, that are transpersonal in that everyone experiences them. We know that with the psychedelic experience, that set is very important, and that if someone is in a negative emotional state or situation that elicits fear and, let's say, rage, and then they embark upon a psychedelic experience, that particular state can be magnified beyond belief. And so that's a good way to have a hellish experience. And so, we do have to remember, and I know, of course, you do, that the psychedelic experiences that we're talking about are ritualized so that an absolutely dreadful outcome is less probable. But you might say if it was just done randomly, it could easily be the magnification of a state of terror or a state of rage as the magnification as a state of enlightenment or bliss.
Right. So this is the importance of the ritual context. This is exactly that. What these traditions have grown around is the idea that there needs to be an appropriate set and setting. There needs to be an appropriate set, the most important variable, certainly. And, I sometimes say in my talks, I say ayahuasca is a liquid. Ayahuasca will fill any vessel you create for it.